Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Hot Topics series of 2023. I'm Jenny Rushlow. I'm the Dean of Vermont School for the Environment, and we're very pleased to welcome you here to our Hot Topics session today. And I am having a quick technical difficulty, so please just give me one moment. While I'm waiting for that to work out, I will just tell you that, as you regular attendees know, these talks are worth 1 CLE credit. And if you're looking to claim that CLE credit, you just need to keep track of the talks that you attend for your records. I'm going to try and pull up the thing that I cannot find here. Okay, so today we have with us as our speaker, Kenny Torella. Kenny Torella is a journalist who's here working with us through our Media Fellows program. Wow, nothing wants to help me out here. Kenny, do you want to just go ahead and give a quick rundown of the publications that you work for, because my notes are not coming up for me?
Oh, sure. Yeah, no problem. Well, so I'm currently a staff writer at Vox, and prior to being at Vox, I actually worked in animal welfare for a little over 10 years at different nonprofits.
Thank you so much. At Vox, a couple of the things that you do, my assistant Courtney just swooped in and handed me what I needed. So I do want to point out just a couple of things that you do at Vox. So you write the Future Perfect section, right, which has a focus on animal welfare and the future of meat, as well as being the author of Meat Less, a Vox newsletter that's designed to help readers incorporate more plant-based foods into their diets. So yes.
Right. Yeah.
And Kenny is one of the kind of first, second generation of our animal law media fellows joining us here over the summer. And the talk that Kenny is presenting today is called The Case Against Pet Ownership. Thank you. Everybody join me in welcoming Kenny, and take it away.
Thanks, Jenny. So I'm going to share my screen. Just someone let me know if for some reason it doesn't work. I think we're in. Jenny, just let me know if for some reason it's not working. But yeah, thanks for the introduction, Jenny. And
actually, I can't see your screen.
Oh, you cannot. Okay, thanks for letting me know. Let me. Yeah, it was working just a moment ago. Oh, maybe. Is that working?
Nope.
Nothing? Okay, 1 second. Sorry, folks. Well, this was working just a moment ago, but as technical difficulties go, they're unexpected. Anything, Jenny?
There you go. Yep.
Hey, we did it. Okay, great. Okay, so at Vox, I primarily focus on animals in the food system and different issues related to that, whether it's the welfare of the animals raised and slaughtered for food, but also, I look at environmental issues related to ag, labor, pollution, and sometimes I'll write about other animal issues or other issues altogether. But when it comes to other animal issues, sometimes it's wildlife, sometimes it's pets. And And I published this article, The Case Against Pet Ownership, about 3 months ago, and it generated more conversation than any article I've written. And so I thought, what better hot topic to give than this one? And I was really surprised by the response. I'm not going to share what the response was generally because I want to save that for the Q&A. I don't want to taint people's impressions on this idea before we get started. But before I get started, I just want to share that, you know, I'm not someone who is looking to just get rid of all companion animals. I am a huge animal lover myself, if that's not obvious. This is my dog, Evie. And prior to Evie, I had a dog named Rihanna who passed away in October 2020. Just 6 weeks later, my partner and I adopted Evie. And she was like a really, you know, spunky, sweet dog at 9 months old. She had had a rough start to her life. She had been passed around from shelter to foster to shelter to foster in the South. And then she was transported up to the Washington, D.C. area where I live. And we adopted her through a rescue organization. But prior to Evie, you know, I've lived with cats and dogs for almost my entire life. And for pretty much my whole adult life, I've worked on animal welfare in one capacity or another. And so it was really adopting Evie and the first few years of having her, it's been about 3 years now, that I really started to slowly question the endeavor of pet keeping altogether. And it really started with Evie because despite how much time and energy my partner and I have to give her a good life, you know, we both work from home, we have flexible schedules, I was still wondering, like, is Evie bored and frustrated all day? Because inevitably I spend a lot of my day just staring at a screen while she just stares out the window, watching birds and squirrels and wanting to chase after them. But obviously she can't. She doesn't really have any autonomy. We live on a busy street. It would be unsafe for me to just let her roam. And yet, I just this question continued to nag at me, is Evie and, you know, the 75 million other dogs that populate American households, are they just kind of bored and frustrated by the constraints of being a dog in a world made for humans? And that inevitably led me to read this book called Run, Spot, Run, The Ethics of Keeping Pets by a bioethicist named Jessica Pierce at the University of Colorado Boulder. She does a lot of work with an ethologist named Mark Beckhoff, who folks who follow animal law or animal welfare might know of. But I just found this book really fascinating and compelling. Highly recommend it. It's essentially 50 really short chapters on different ethical issues in pet keeping. And really the big idea that Pierce tries to communicate is that, you know, we have this very wholesome and sunny, positive narrative around pets. And I think for a lot of us on this call who are probably animal lovers, we feel that every day. I mean, every day I'm excited to see Evie. Right now, you know, I'm away from her and I miss her every day. And, you know, the dog-human bond is incredibly powerful. You know, humans domesticated dogs up to 40,000 years ago. And so they've been a huge part of human civilization ever since. But what Pierce is really trying to get at in this book is that despite this, you know, very positive narrative of dogs and other animals being man's best friend, there are a whole host of ethical issues that arise when we try to keep animals, many of them not even domesticated. You know, cats are considered to be semi-domesticated, and then all of the fish and amphibians and reptiles we keep are wild animals, essentially. And what she's trying to say is that behind this positive narrative, there is actually a lot that we should grapple with as pet owners and animal lovers. And, you know, in her book, she starts off with the really ugly, really nasty issues that any decent person would condemn, such as breeding dogs for puppy mills, where many of them have physical issues just by virtue of their breed, such as dogs like pugs and French bulldogs who can have a lot of respiratory issues, especially as they grow older, or dogs like dachshunds and corgis who can have back issues as they get older. You know, those dogs that are bred to be, you know, really low and long, essentially low riders. There's also physical abuse. There is dog fighting, which is a bigger problem than a lot of us probably assume, as I recently learned. There's also the issue of bestiality. There was a message board in 2019 for people who are into bestiality, and it was shut down, but before it was shut down, it had almost 2 million members. So again, I think this is another problem where it's probably bigger than we really can understand. And then lastly, there's the issue of animal hoarding. So these are the big issues that everyone thinks are wrong. Everyone probably agrees there should be laws against these issues. But then there's a whole other host of, you know, bad but generally acceptable, or at least pretty much legal in most states, problems. And I'll just give folks, you know, 30 seconds to read through that before I make comments on some of them. Okay, so first off, punitive training. You know, I think it says a lot that one of the most, maybe the most popular dog trainer in the US is Cesar Millan, who is known for employing some aversive training methods, which have been proven to, you know, increase anxiety and fear and aggression. There's also the issue of prolonged captivity and extreme confinement. I think, you know, when it comes to extreme confinement, a lot of people leave their dogs in crates for a long part of the day, which is a controversial issue among a lot of animal folks. It's even banned in Finland, which I recently learned, crating animals for prolonged periods. But I also think that in many ways, the cats and dogs who populate American households, really around the world, live in a state of captivity. You know, these are animals, much like wild animals, who gain so much of their sense of the world through smell and exploration and foraging, and yet those behaviors are often either heavily restricted or moderately restricted just by virtue of it being dangerous for animals to roam the streets. There's also mutilations, such as declawing and ear and tail docking. Kind of tied to prolonged captivity is lack of autonomy. Dogs and cats, I mean, especially dogs, rely on us for virtually everything, to go to the bathroom, to eat, to socialize with other dogs, to see people, to see new people, and to have new experiences. They're really at our mercy. I also think it's an issue. I don't know how much I can back this up with evidence. Maybe someone else on this call could talk. We could talk about this in the Q&A. But I cook for my dog. She does get kibble, but about half of her diet is food that I cook, because I think you know, kibble is a somewhat you know, just decades old phenomenon, and I think it could very well be a welfare issue that we just feed them this kind of boring, bland diet day in, day out. When it comes to inadequate veterinary care, there was one survey recently that found that only 1/5 of people brought their dogs in for annual checkups. And I think the number was drastically lower for cats. So there's a big problem of cats not getting sufficient veterinary care or checkups. And again, these issues, lack of exercise and socialization and boredom, are kind of tied to the prolonged captivity issue. And then abandonment. There has been some research that has found around 10 to 20% of cats and dogs are actually returned to the shelter, often due to quote unquote behavioral issues. But also, you know, some of them are more common sense, like allergies. But then also a lot of times people might return their dog or cat to the shelter because of costs. There's also dog and cat on human conflict, and also human on human conflict that arises out of the endeavor of pet keeping. And this is happening on a pretty large scale. In the US, there's about 250 million animals kept as pets. More than half of those are just dogs and fish. And then coming in third are cats at 58 million. And then the rest are made up by birds, rodents, reptiles, amphibians, and also pet livestock, like horses, but also people who keep, a small number of, say, chickens for eggs. And this is only growing. From 2011 to 2020, the percent of households that have a dog or cat grew by 8%. And there's not really good data on exactly why this has grown. I suspect one reason could be the human loneliness epidemic. The US Surgeon General has really cited loneliness as a major human health issue, at least in the US. And I think in many ways, as I'll talk about in a moment, we expect pets to fill a lot of that loneliness void. So on top of all that, animal laws tend to be insufficient. They're hard to enforce, or they're weakly enforced. And, since animals are confined and cooped up for most of their lives, a lot of the abuse and neglect that occurs in the privacy of the home. It's not a situation in which, say, if a child is neglected or abused, eventually that might surface in school or among peers or family members. And again, I think a lot of the neglect that occurs among pet owners is maybe not intentional and could be forgiven to a degree, but I think it is still a serious welfare issue. I mean, things as simple as not clipping a dog's nails, not brushing their teeth, kind of some of these basic needs are often unmet. I mean, I say that anecdotally as someone who has known many, really good, kind, compassionate people. I go to their house and I see how their dogs look, and I can see signs of neglect. And I know a lot of animal folks who I've talked to have experienced the same thing. And so, in summary, our relationship to pets is one in which we expect and take a lot and we give a little. And I think one thing that really illuminated this to me when I was talking to Jessica Pierce, the bioethicist, she framed it this way, is that when we domesticated dogs, their role was to help us hunt and to protect us. And they had a big role to play. And it gave them likely some sense of purpose. But now their main purpose is to provide companionship, which Pierce argues is actually a much harder job, and one that, dogs and cats can have a harder time fulfilling. And if they don't fit into our needs and society's rules, we can often chalk it up to how they behave as just mere misbehavior. But it's actually, those are often signs of unmet needs. And so, again, we have this expectation that pets are our companions. I mean, there are surveys done when people are asked, why do you get a pet? It's often for that person. They want someone to cuddle with. They want someone to greet them when they come home. They want a companion. Conversely, when you ask people why they don't get a pet, it's pet-centered. They are afraid that they don't have the money or time to give the pet a good life. And so even though I think a lot of pet owners are well-meaning and certainly don't want to hurt their animal, their motivations might be more around what they need rather than what the animal needs. And so again, the question that really set me off on exploring all of this was my own worry and guilt around my dog, Evie, that she was just bored for a lot of the day. And now, dog experts are clear on that dogs need a lot of downtime. They need time to rest and recoup and just chill out. And Evie will certainly do a lot of that. She loves to nap. But if too many hours went by where I was just staring at my screen working, and she was sleeping for extended periods of time, she would start to bark. She would start to either bark at me, saying like, hey, come on, let's go do something. And as soon as I took her on a walk or played with her, she would stop barking. So she was clearly trying to, explain what her needs were, or she's, staring out the window when I am just too busy to take care of her. And it's not just during the work hours. I mean, there are also obviously extended periods of the day where I might be out doing something with friends or running errands. And because, again, of the constraints of human society, I can't take Evie with me for much of that. And so I think a lot of times when we think about our pets, we think about the time that we spend with them and the special relationship we have with them. But absent from that is all those hours spent where they have little to no enrichment. They don't have a lot that they can do. They don't have autonomy. And, we're distracted with friends, with work, with obligations, with errands, with chores. And so I think, a lot of cats and dogs spend a significant portion of their life potentially bored without much ability to entertain themselves. And so I'm just going to read some quotes from folks I talked to illuminate this. So Charlotte Byrne, a veterinarian and biologist in the United Kingdom, told me that, this is her quote, for most of us, boredom is a transient thing, and we can do something about it. But when you cannot do anything about it, it's incredibly distressing. Sometimes it's thought of as kind of a luxury problem for animals, but actually it may not be so luxurious if an animal can't do anything about it, and it might actually be a massive welfare issue. And so she and some other researchers have turned cameras on to observe what dogs do all day while we're gone. And a lot of them will either sleep for extended periods of time, some of which is totally normal and healthy, but there can also be a lot of yawning or howling and barking, which could very well, be signs of anxiety, stress, or even boredom, Byrne told me. Kind of related to this, going back to what Jessica Pierce was telling me about the first job of dogs and cats was to protect us, and now it's to be our companions. A quote I had from her that I wanted to share is that she said, everybody assumes that pets are well off and in fact pampered. All they have to do is lay around in a bed and get fed treats every now and then and catch a Frisbee if they feel like it. Who wouldn't want that life? But underneath that is the reality that doing nothing but laying in a bed and having treats fed to you is profoundly frustrating and boring, and that's not a meaningful life for an animal. And I think, one thing I want to point out here that I probably should have said at the top is that this is highly variable. Every cat, dog, other kind of pet is an individual unto themselves. Some are going to have very high needs for socialization, for play, for exercise, for enrichment. Some will need much less. Some pet owners will have an incredible amount of time and energy and money to give their dog or cat or other animal an amazing life. Some people are really restricted. They might have tons of childcare. There might be no one who can see the dog or cat, for 10 plus hours a day while everyone else in the household is out at work or at school or other obligations. And so that's one thing I want to say up front. I'm sure a lot of the folks on this call are probably falling into the first category where they really prioritize their pets. But I think among the general population, with most people still not working from home, and there have been some time. There was one time survey done in pre-COVID that found that people just spend 40 minutes a day with their pet. And so I think really exploring this boredom issue is pretty critical here. As Byrne said, it could be a massive welfare issue that most of us are unaware of or don't think about much. But again, I just want to point out the caveat that all of this is highly variable depending on the animal and depending on the human. But to that end, again, Mark Beckoff, who I talked to for this article, is a well-known ethologist in the animal welfare space, said, some people I know just leave their house at 7 a.m. They go to work, they go work out, or they go out for dinner. So the average dog is just going to be alone all day. And then they get home and they're tired and they don't walk them and they give them crappy food. Those people should not have a dog. We'll touch more on that in a bit. And so one other survey that I found pretty compelling was, folks may have seen this kind of narrative that came out in the media around how shelters were emptying during the first year or so of the pandemic, and that was incredible. But after a year or two of people working from home and many of them going back to work, Forbes did this survey of pet owners who were going back to work and found really high rates of behavioral issues such as barking and howling, chewing, digging, destruction, escape attempts. 1/3 reported urinating or defecating indoors, and other issues. And I think one other thing I want to point out here is that the human social contract that we have just prevents us from giving most pets a good life. So I'll first start with dogs. I think, again, speaking to this problem that, unless you live, well, some folks here, especially at VLGS, might have a lot of land and can give their pets more outdoor off-leash time than the average, suburbanite or urbanite. But I live in the suburbs of Washington, D.C., and essentially Evie always has to be on a leash, which she does not like being on. And whether, pretty much no matter where I take her, even if I take her to the woods and I take her to the woods where there are little to no people, there's a million signs saying, keep your dog on leash, which admittedly, sometimes I do disobey that. But even then, sometimes I'm worried, is she going to run into another dog who's on leash and maybe there will be aggression there. So I think one major issue that I am just always kind of feeling in my day-to-day relationship with Evie is that she is living in this society in which most of her just basic instincts have to be thwarted. I mean, even when I take her on a walk, if she's following a scent that leads too far into someone's front yard, I have to pull her back and get her back onto the sidewalk. It's just really hard to give dogs a level of freedom that I think it's pretty clear that they want, at least in Evie's case, if you're living in a city or a suburb, which most Americans do. And then also, dogs are banned from most places. It's been nice to see some dogs in cafes in Vermont, but that is just something you never see in the Washington, D.C. area or most places. And so that means they often have to be left at home. And sometimes that's for good reason. I'm not saying dogs should just be allowed everywhere all the time. And then there's the issue of indoor versus outdoor cats. There have been some studies showing that outdoor cats kill billions of birds and other wildlife annually. And there's a very fierce debate, between some, environmentalists and animal welfare communities. And there are real trade-offs there. I do think there are some real ethical issues with keeping a cat indoors for virtually their entire life. At the same time, I think there are really serious ethical issues with allowing cats to spend a lot of their time outdoors and, rack up a huge death count of birds and rodents. And so this is just yet another example in which there's really thick tension between what animals need to have a good life and what we can give them, given the constraints of the world we live in. And then, there's the 100 million or more so animals who are not dogs or cats and are essentially, wild animals confined in small tanks and cages for their entire lives. Birds, I'd have to go back to my pie chart, but I think there's around 6-7 million birds, 75 million fish, and then millions of amphibians and reptiles and rodents. And there's limited research in the welfare of these I believe there's limited research in the welfare of these animals. They're clearly not studied as much as cats and dogs when it comes to their welfare as pets. But there has been some research, and I think it's also, just common sense that these animals that naturally, would be spending their time traveling great distances in the wild and, foraging, hunting, instead they're confined to these tiny cages and tanks for most of their lives. But there's a lot that we can do to give animals a better life. We can give them more outdoor time. We can provide more indoor enrichments. Jessica Pierce told me that if you have a cat, you should have a house that looks like a cat lives there. And so she recommended checking out the YouTube page of this guy, Jackson Galaxy, who has a video about how one can catify one's home by having perches and walkways and scratch boxes. To just give cats a much more enriching indoor life. And there are also some products out there that can be put on cats that alert and scare off birds and rodents as well. I also think, we can commit to giving our pets more of our time and energy and commit to learning positive training methods. And we can also do a lot more to explore laws that restrict puppy mills and outdoor tethering, mutilations, and other issues. The title of this talk is The Case Against Pet Ownership. And so obviously the big question is, should we end pet ownership? And, some of the more animal welfare, animal rights minded cat and dog experts I talked to kind of landed in this place of not really committing to one side or the other, essentially saying, look, we've ended up with this, we've ended up in a place where we have hundreds of millions of pets, and there are a lot of ethical issues there. There's a lot we can do to reform it. And I don't know if we're going back and ending pet ownership, but there's so much we can do to radically reform how we treat pets, how we source pets, and the laws that are meant to protect them. I think one thing that, and when it comes to the groups that some of the largest animal welfare groups like ASPCA and Humane Society of the United States, they don't outright say, we should end all pet breeding. But these groups and really the mainstream animal welfare and rights movements kind of have this idea of one, we should adopt and not shop, which if everyone followed that advice, the number of pets in the country would drastically shrink. And the same goes with, the famous advice of spay and neuter your pets. And again, if everyone spayed and neutered their pets, the pet population would drastically fall. And so that begs the question of should we actually end pet ownership, or is that a direction that we go in when we logically follow the animal welfare movement's two main slogans around what to do with how you acquire a pet and what to do right after you acquire them, is to adopt one and then spay or neuter them. And, it's a really unpopular opinion on its face, but I think when we take into account the lack of legal protections, the ability to enforce any legal protections if they were enacted, and then the natural constraints put on pets living in a human world, I do think it's a question we should grapple with more. And I also think we should have a much higher bar as to who and what conditions someone needs to give their pet a good life. Because right now, it's essentially, if you want a pet, it's very easy to acquire one. And of course, I don't want to deter people from adopting. I want to see the euthanasia number continue to go down, and it has. which is an incredible thing, and the testament of the work of so many people, from people working on policy and working directly in shelters. But ultimately, it's very easy to acquire a pet, and then there are very little restrictions on what you can do with that animal, or very little ability to enforce laws that are meant to protect them. And so I don't really have a clear answer on this. Where I ended was, that we should have a world with far fewer and far happier pets. And so I think some of those big things come down to, putting, ensuring that people understand that pet ownership is a much bigger responsibility than they might think. That pets require a lot of time, a lot of patience, a lot of energy, a lot of money. And so I think, setting a higher bar, whether it's culturally or even having some kind of test, a Great Dane should probably not live in a Manhattan studio, would go a long way to improving the welfare of pets. It's hard for me to imagine not having a cat or dog in my life. But I think, if we look at this issue from an animal rights perspective, an animal rights perspective asks, or even kind of tells us, that animals are not here, as the PETA saying goes, animals are not here for us to eat, or they're not here for us to wear or to experiment on, and so on. But I think in the case of pets, they are kind of here as a companionship we put on them and then expect them to perform very well. And they're also almost kind of like an accessory or toy. And that can explain, the rise of kind of the boutique pet, the boutique breeding. And so I think this is one of those kind of maybe taboo aspects of exploring animal rights, but I think it's one that we should do a lot more to question and interrogate. And I certainly don't have all the answers. I ended, writing this article with a lot more questions than answers. But I'm really glad it generated a lot of discussion. And I also think this gets at one of the bigger questions around so much animal welfare work, is that we ultimately can't get into the minds of animals and know exactly what they need and what they want. But I think they tell us in so many ways that so many of the norms around modern pet keeping are not working for them. So yeah, I want to now open it up for time for any questions, or if folks want to share. I know I covered a lot of ground, and I'll also add that I wrote this article several months ago, and so I'm not in the weeds as much as I was back then. And so there are probably some things I omitted or forgot. But yeah, I want to open it up for questions now.
Awesome. Thank you, Kenny. So for our folks who are joining us today, we have time for Q&A. And the way that you can give us your questions is by going to the chat or the comment space on Facebook or on YouTube. And we'll get through as many of the questions as we can, and I'll facilitate those with Kenny. So I'm sure this was a very provocative talk for many of our viewers. Hot Topics is living up to its name today. And so an initial question is about transition to this kind of new world that you described. There are major transitional problems that would likely exacerbate the suffering of individual animals that are currently alive if suddenly people are not taking in this full stock of animals that are currently available as pets. So what happens to that stock of pets if people, stop getting puppies from pet shops and breeders, and doesn't that create suffering as well?
Yeah, very well could. This is a great question and probably fodder for a follow-up article. I mean, my article, there was so much I had to cut, and it ended up being 4,000 words anyways, which is like way too long. And so I did want to really explore this idea of what would it actually look like to do this. And I haven't given it much thought. I'm glad this question was raised. And I really wanted to do this talk today with a bunch of lawyers because I don't know that much about companion animal law and some of the limits there to push companion animal law. I'm familiar with restrictions around puppy mills because I wrote something about that once, but sorry, going back to transition. So I think, right now, we are in this place where I think right now there's about ASPCA estimated there's around 920,000 cats and dogs euthanized every year. And pet demand is actually even higher than that. I think a few million pets are acquired every year. And so there's also this mismatch between demand and supply that even if everyone adopted all those 920,000 animals, there would still need to be more animals to be bred to meet the demand of the number of pets Americans want. And so I think, when it comes to a question of a transition, I think what would make the most sense is to first kind of stem the flow of new animals coming in to existence. And that means putting caps on breeding. Right now, puppy mills, don't have that many restrictions, certainly federally, but even in large puppy mill breeding states. The restrictions are, I think, pretty weak. So I think in terms of how messy would a transition be, I think that question is almost getting ahead of where we are right now, where puppy mills and kitten mills are still such a big problem, and also rabbit breeding, fish breeding, etc., that it's almost I don't mean this as a cop-out, and maybe part of it is that I just have not spent enough time thinking about it, but I'd encourage this person, if they have ideas, to certainly reach out to me. My email is on my Vox profile. But I think it's even maybe too early to ponder what the transition issues could really look like if it played out. Because right now we're still just breeding so many cats and dogs that there should be no short-term fears of just animals being mass euthanized, because that's not what I'm suggesting at all. That was a long way of saying, love that question. I'm going to spend some more time thinking about it, and maybe write an article kind of teasing through what are the ugly challenges and maybe some of the ways that a transition to reducing the pet population could actually hurt animals, because could certainly be a concern.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Great provocative talk. Thank you. What sorts of legal changes would you like to see implemented in light of the questions you've raised?
I think the biggest one is just more state restrictions on puppy mills. There are some states that have been more proactive on this than others, like Missouri, Pennsylvania, I believe, Ohio. Maybe some of the puppy mill advocates out there could fact check me on that. But I think to start with, that seems like the biggest issue. The conditions on puppy mills, the number of animals, and then also, I don't have answers to this, but I know that there's a loophole in the Animal Welfare Act in which many breeders, I believe, if they're selling, I'm not gonna misspeak here because I got into the weeds on breeding in puppy mills months ago. But essentially, there's a loophole in which many breeders don't need to be licensed under, by the USDA. And so there's also this large black market, which is much harder to regulate. And so I think that is another legal change that could go a long way. And I don't know what it would look like, but I think maybe some kind of test that gets at like how good could an animal's welfare be if they're in a particular home setup, whether that means the space that they have, and then also, so not even just space, but also time. Like, I think this is where it gets a little tricky and even regressive too, because if you say, okay, cats and dogs need a lot of time and attention and also money, it can then become a very classist kind of test to say, well, only the wealthy people with more time on their hands who work from home can give a pet a good life. And I don't think that's necessarily true. That's something I'd want to think through more. I mean, one response to my article was, what if we had a test like that, but then we had government support where if someone adopts an animal, but they are lower income, they could have, there could be an entitlement to, just like SNAP, maybe you could use that money to buy pet insurance or vet care. So I think there are some maybe creative ideas around how to get around these issues. So that's one idea. But honestly, I really wanted to come to you all to like, what are some like maybe basic, but also novel legal ideas to set a higher bar for how pets are treated.
Yeah, I suspect you're going to get more questions than answers on that in the next 15 minutes. But for folks who are on campus this summer, Kenny is here and can be found for discussion on this. Another question, what do you think about changes to the language of pet ownership to pet guardian? Do you think that this is a helpful linguistic and perhaps legal change?
Yeah, so I'm glad this was raised because, I know language is really sensitive among, in the animal community. And, I am more likely to say companion, or I don't like the word owner. I did use the word pet and the word owner, honestly, just for like simple readability to make this easier for people to grasp and understand. And I didn't want to try to bog the reader down in too much extra when I was already trying to make a really tough, big argument. I do think it's important. I've also read counter arguments to this idea that we should use guardian or like legally use the word guardian rather than owner. Because at the end of the day, these animals are property. And to say guardian, I guess, you could, I'm not convinced one way on this, honestly, but I could see the argument saying that using the word guardian kind of elevates it. You're not just an owner, you're a guardian, you're there to protect this animal's life. At the same time, maybe that obscures the reality that animals are owned. There are little consequences to hurting them. And that could almost obfuscate, the property status of animals.
It's a so that question was from our Tuesday speaker, Professor Angela Fernandez, and then there was another question as a follow-up to Angela's talk. The question was, there's some interesting overlap between your talk and Professor Fernandez's talk on Tuesday. What impact do you think the legal status of pets as property has on this issue? Is there anything more you would add to that?
I would defer to Angela as she's the lawyer. But I found her talk really compelling, and I find these bigger conversations around animal personhood and the legal status of animals to be really interesting. I mean, I imagine that if pets had personhood status, it would just totally turn the world upside down, probably in a lot of positive ways. There would be a lot more consequences for a lot of the welfare issues I outlined. But yeah, I'd defer to Angela and others on what that can mean.
Okay. Some argue that allowing animals full rights includes the ability to engage in their genetically driven behaviors, which includes fundamentally procreation. Arguably, it's paternalistic to interfere with this behavior. and doing so is more of a harm reduction measure and not truly rights oriented. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I love this question. And it's actually, this was something that got cut, and it's actually something Jessica Pierce explores. This idea that, desexing animals strips them of the ability of this very basic behavior that every animal on Earth, exists to do. And I've been kicking around writing something about it, so please don't steal my headline, but it's to snip or not to snip. I think it's a really fascinating issue. And obviously, again, maybe this is another example where we have to put this constraint on pets, given the world that we live in. Although, I don't know, maybe you could argue that with pets being on leashes all day when they're outside, the threat of, accidental pregnancies and leading to further pet overpopulation are overblown. I honestly don't know enough about it yet to have a strong feeling around it, but I think it's a really interesting, provocative idea unto itself, because spay and neuter your pets has kind of become like just a motto in the animal welfare movement that no one ever really questions it. But I think questioning it is fascinating.
Question, this strikes me as more of a case against inadequate or inhumane pet ownership, assuming there is such a thing as acceptable ownership. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's why I landed at not totally saying let's totally wind down the pet population, but let's really shrink it. And let's really shrink it out of the precautionary principle that, given the constraints of modern life, a lot of people don't have the time and energy and money to meet a lot of pets' basic behavioral needs. And that also, again, I think it's so easy to focus on cats and dogs, and I often do. But if you look at fish and birds and rodents and reptiles and amphibians, if you take those out of the 250 million, again, the pet population drastically shrinks, because I think it's just practically impossible to give them a really good life if they're just going to be in a cage all day. There aren't a lot of other options. So yeah, I think to answer that question head on, I think it is kind of a case for ending inadequate pet ownership. And some people certainly argue that there is no such thing as adequate pet ownership, kind of like what was implied in the question of, like, is ownership ever ethical? Gary Francione and Anna Charlton are, two of the kind of more famous thinkers here on this issue of just let's totally abolish pet ownership, because it's almost never going to be in, how we keep pets is almost never going to be in their best interests. And we just can't do it right. So yeah, I guess that's the kind of like where I landed, was like, if you set a very high bar for what constitutes adequate pet ownership, logically what follows is like a drastic reduction in the pet population.
Okay. Do you think with the current situation that animal rights advocates are obligated to rescue animals and give them a good life, even if they have these reservations or mental struggles with pet ownership?
I think so. I mean, that's what I do. I both kind of try to reconcile that I'd rather have Evie live with me and my partner, give her as good of a life as possible than euthanize her. But I struggle with it. I think some people can get to a really nihilistic place with this and wonder, is it better to just euthanize them than to give them what could be a poor to mediocre to maybe good life? Ultimately, a lot of this is a mystery too. It's like, who knows, maybe Evie is like the happiest dog ever and I'm just misinterpreting her behavior. I'm very open to that possibility. And maybe I'm misinterpreting the behavior of so many other cats and dogs. And not just me, but, actual experts. But yeah, I mean, I ended my article kind of saying that as long as there are dogs and cats languishing in shelters, I'm going to have one, maybe more, in my household. But I do think a slow, deliberate, very intentional process of shrinking the pet population would be a net positive for animal welfare.
Okay, so one last question. You mentioned earlier in your talk that dogs have been domesticated for over 40,000 years. Haven't they evolved to adjust to the human needs you described in that period of time?
They could have. I don't know. I'd like to hear from like a canine expert on this one, but I actually just listened to a Vox. I'll do a little promo. I listened to a Vox podcast yesterday about tribalism, and in this podcast, the interview subject was talking about how if you think about human history as a 100-minute movie, it's only until the last like 5 seconds that modern civilization became as we know it today. And so dogs over the last 30, 40,000 years have had radically different lifestyles than they do now. They probably spent much more of their time outdoors. I don't think, cavemen had leashes. Maybe not cavemen, but, our very, very, very distant ancestors had leashes or kibble. And I'm sure there are ways in which, dogs have higher welfare and health needs met today. But I think some very basic things like play and social time and exercise were, met much better before, we put dogs into the suburbs and had them, be home for much of the day alone with nothing to do.
Okay, we should wrap up there so that folks can get to their 1 o'clock classes, but that was fascinating and provocative and courageous, I might say, to present that point of view, which I admire. So thank you to everybody who joined us for Kenny's presentation. Next week is summer break at Vermont Law and Graduate School. So if you've been coming to all these talks, note that the next one will take place on Tuesday, July 11th. Happy Independence Day, and we'll see you all soon. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.